welcome back to the NATO History Podcast, NATO Through Time, where we take you through some of the interesting, dramatic, consequential moments in NATO's very rich, often colourful 75 years of existence. And today I'm delighted to be once again joined by a co-host who's going to share the burden of the questions with me. I'm particularly delighted today when we're going to be looking so much at the transatlantic dimension of NATO to welcome back to the podcast Preston Stewart, who certainly represents a much younger generation than I do. Preston, you're in Tennessee, so thanks again for joining us. And I know today that you particularly wanted to be on the podcast because we're going to be talking about 9/11, 2001, those dramatic terrorist attacks against the United States. And I know that this influenced you at the time personally, your life pattern, your career personally as well. So just very, very briefly, say a few words about that.
Well, thank you so much, Jamie, for having me back. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Lord Robertson today. So this hits home for me. I still am in the Army Reserve here in the United States, and I joined primarily because of the attacks on 9/11. I was a sophomore in high school at the time, and kind of at a point in my life trying to make a decision on what I was going to do after high school, what college might look like and what service might look like. And for myself and a lot of my peers in the military, 9/11 is kind of the defining moment that really in a lot of ways changed our life and directed us to where we are today. So I'm excited to get an inside look here of what was going on at NATO during that time and the role NATO played in 9/11 and then the subsequent war in Afghanistan.
Well, you're absolutely right. It changed your life personally, and it certainly changed the life for all of us here who were at NATO at the time in the alliance. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. Today's guest is Lord George Robertson, Lord Robertson of Port Ellen, who was the Secretary General of NATO in a particularly important period for the alliance from 1999 to 2003. Before then, he was the UK Defence Minister. He was a senior politician in the Labour Party. He played a particularly active role, as I remember well, in 1999 during the NATO intervention in Kosovo, shortly before he was invited to be Secretary General. But of course, he was also here at NATO during 9/11, the terrorist attacks against New York and Washington, which we'll be talking about today, when NATO activated the Article 5 collective defence guarantee for the first time in its history, and later on during the time of the United States intervention in Iraq in 2003. He also played a very influential role at the time in reaching out to Russia and to Vladimir Putin, which I know may seem to many of our listeners rather counterintuitive today in 2024. But at that time, as I'm sure Lord Robertson will explain, it was a different world, a different Putin, perhaps at least a different atmosphere and possibilities to engage Russia, which unfortunately do not exist at the moment. So in short, there is an enormous amount to talk about. Lord Robertson, George, as I call you, but I worked for you for many years and very happily. Great to have you on the podcast on behalf of Preston and I. Thanks very much for giving us your time. Please say hello to the audience and then we'll get straight to the substance of the business.
Hello, I'm delighted to be able to take part in this podcast. As somebody once said, I'm no longer part of modern studies at school. I'm part of history, historical relic, I have to say. But there we go. That's the way age brings me up. But I'm looking forward to reliving some moments of history. But well, I've got a long time to go yet.
Well, absolutely, Lord Robertson, because you not only represent history, but you also represent the future. You've been asked to lead the new UK Defence Review, very important, of course, the UK, an important ally, as it plans its forces for the future. So what you've gained from history certainly is not being put on any dusty library shelf, but is certainly going to feed into the future.
Sir, first off, Lord Robertson, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, sir. It's an absolute honor. I was hoping to start with your time before NATO. Did you work with the organization prior to your time as Secretary General? And what was that lead up that you took to become the Secretary General of NATO?
Well, let me go back even further, because I got involved in politics at the age of 15, which was in 1961, when I was demonstrating against the arrival of the American nuclear weapons submarines on the Firth of Clyde, where I lived and where I was at school. I became animated and involved in the politics of the time. And it might seem strange that I ended up running a military and nuclear alliance, and that actually was in charge of Britain's independent nuclear deterrent. But a lot of water flowed down the Clyde in between there. So I went to university, and I was still a great nuclear disarmer at that time, and became a trade union official, and was elected to Parliament in 1978. I became a defence spokesman in 1981, where I was the shadow minister for the Navy at that time. And then I started to focus on European issues and helped to create mayhem for the Conservative government when they tried to sign the Maastricht Treaty. I was named Parliamentarian of the Year at that time for the mischief that I created. And I then became the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland, and I put together the devolution settlement, the creation of the Scottish Parliament. And in 1997, having been in the Shadow Cabinet, we won the election in 1997, and Tony Blair made me the Secretary of State for Defence. And that is when, I did a major defence review at that time, reorganised the British Armed Forces very substantially at that time in the Strategic Defence Review of 1998. And then we were plunged into the Kosovo conflict in 1999. Where myself and Mr. Jamie Shea became internationally famous for doing daily press conferences then. So I was the London end of that operation, which was remarkably successful. After 78 days, we defeated the enemy, Milosevic's Serbia, and we returned all the refugees who had been driven out of Kosovo back to their homes. And I've just been in Kosovo celebrating the 25th anniversary of the end of that military operation in June of 1999. So I came to prominence at that time, and Javier Solana, my predecessor, was leaving to go and be the High Representative of the European Union on foreign policy. There was a vacancy for NATO Secretary General, and Tony Blair said, "I want you to go to NATO," and I said no, and I said no 3 times until basically I was told it wasn't really a choice at all, and I left my constituency, I left Parliament, I left the cabinet, I left the country, and I went to live in Belgium. And as I say, I left my job, left my home, left my country, and got a new name. And in America, they call that a witness protection scheme. But I was told it was promotion, and I was then the Secretary General, the 10th Secretary General of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Hell of a job. Yeah,
but you were very much embedded, of course, in British politics. You were a great parliamentarian, a loyal representative of your constituency, and all of those things were dear to you. So it was also good that you had the sense of public duty and service to come to NATO. Let's go to the 9/11 attacks. So we're jumping ahead a bit, of course, because they occurred a couple of years into your tenure. But, of course, they were a very big moment for NATO. We said earlier, the first time NATO invoked the Article 5 Collective Defence Clause, I remember it as a bolt from the blue, not anticipating it and rather confused and wondering at first what was going on. It was a very dramatic day for you, sir. So could you take us through the events of that day and what you were feeling and what you were thinking and how you sort of, framed the decisions, the very consequential decisions that came came about as a result of that?
Like the rest of the world, we were a nice sunny day and quiet day. We were dealing with NATO business. The permanent representatives, the ambassadors to NATO, had a Tuesday lunch every week, off the record, private, cloistered away, preparing for the North Atlantic Council the following day. And there we were discussing things when one of my bodyguards came into the room and passed me a note saying, and that was itself quite unusual, saying there has been an incident in New York, a plane has hit a building. So I announced that to the ambassadors. And I think most of us thought, a training airplane, had crashed into a building by mistake. A few minutes later, the bodyguard came back into the room with another note saying a second plane has hit. And at that point, we decided there was something really big on. So the lunch was abandoned. We all climbed into our cars. We drove back to the headquarters. I listened to the BBC World Service on the way back. And in my room in the office, we all watched the same television pictures that were being watched around the world of the Twin Towers on fire. One of them then collapsing. And I have to say that at that point, I began to realize that we weren't just spectators. We weren't just onlooking like the rest of the world, horrified with what was happening. We were in a military headquarters. We were NATO, and we were involved in this. And so I gave an order to evacuate all non-emergency people from the building because we could have easily been a target. Got on the phone to Eurocontrol, the passenger air traffic control across the road, to see whether there were any flights going out of Belgium that would be coming in back again, and therefore might have been involved in targeting our headquarters. And then we sat down with the ambassadors to NATO to hear from the American ambassador from what was happening. At that time, we were shocked, we were concerned, we realized that something dramatic had happened that was going to change, in many ways the world, as indeed it did. But I then sort of said to my colleagues, look, America has been attacked. And Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty makes it clear that an attack on one country is an attack on all countries. Now, at that stage, we didn't know whether it was a domestic act of terrorism. There had been acts of terrorism in America before, but if it had been a foreign attack, then it qualified, and therefore I had to phone up Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, the key players in America to say, look, you've been attacked. What about Article 5? And I said, well, what do you mean, what about Article 5? And I said, well, you've been attacked. And we are a military alliance, and we are an alliance that's committed to common defense. So they said, yeah, but make sure you can get it, you can get it through, because we had to put it to the council, to the other 18 ambassadors. So when I was satisfied the following day that that was the case, we put the statement to the council. And after about 6 or 7 hours on the phone to various prime ministers and presidents, I got final agreement from all of them that we would go for Article 5. And in fact, we did it at 9:30 at night, aided by Jamie Shea, head of press. I went to talk to the assembled press and announced that if it was an attack from abroad, then an attack on the United States was to be seen as an attack on all countries in NATO. The only time that NATO had invoked the Article 5 commitment.
Yeah, before or since.
Indeed. And frankly, I think I'll be the only person ever to do it, because I don't think anybody else would dream of crossing that Article 5 line. But it was only basically when I was reading out that statement to the assembled press that I began to realize just how significant it was.
Thank you very much for coming here this evening. The North Atlantic Council met tonight to express its solidarity with the United States of America at this moment of great tragedy and mourning. Our deepest sympathy lies with the victims, their families, and all Americans. The NATO nations unanimously condemn these barbaric acts committed against a NATO member state. At this critical moment, the United States can rely on its 18 allies in North America and Europe for both assistance and for support. NATO solidarity remains the essence of our alliance. Our message to the people of the United States is that we are with you. Our message to those who perpetrated these unspeakable crimes is equally clear. You will not get away with it. On September the 12th, the North Atlantic Council met again in response to the appalling attacks perpetrated yesterday against the United States of America. The Council agreed that if it is determined that this attack was directed from abroad against the United States, it shall be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states that an armed attack against one or more of the allies in Europe or in North America shall be considered an attack against them all. The facts are clear and compelling. The information presented points conclusively to an al-Qaeda role in the 11th of September attacks. We know that the individuals who carried out these attacks were part of the worldwide terrorist network, al-Qaeda, headed by Osama bin Laden and his key lieutenants, and protected by the Taliban. On the basis of this briefing, it has now been determined that the attack against the United States of America on the 11th of September was directed from abroad and shall therefore be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty.
Yes, sir. There's a lot of confusion about Article 5, and to your point, it's only been invoked one time, but I wanted to get your thoughts, or if you could explain, how exactly does that process work? Could NATO countries be pulled into a war without their consent? Does an attack automatically mean that all of NATO is at war? And if Article 5 is invoked, what does that require of the member states?
It's a very, very good question, and it's one that is actually very pertinent to today. So if a country is attacked, then it goes to NATO and it says, we are attacked and we're invoking Article 5. But Article 5 was very carefully constructed. Your fellow countrymen in the United States Senate were very keen to make sure that they were not going to be dragged into some European civil war. And therefore, there are two parts to Article 5. One is that an attack is to be seen as an attack on all. And that's a political declaration, which requires consensus. And secondly, the individual countries make a decision as to what they're going to do about it. So it's not automatically getting the integrated military command into place. There are very separate decisions that have to be taken. And in this case, in this particular case, we put it to the Council, so we got the consensus and everybody agreed. Then we waited to see what the United States was going to ask for in terms of Article 5. And it was a couple of weeks later that actually the letter arrived with me on the day I was meeting Vladimir Putin for only the second time. And at the press conference after my meeting with Vladimir Putin, and I think this might be interesting to your younger audience, a man from Le Monde, the French newspaper, asked the question, did you tell President Putin what the Americans have asked for under Article 5? Now, I'd completely forgotten to mention it to him. I thought, I would have done it out of courtesy. I suddenly thought, God, I forgot to tell him. And at that precise point, Vladimir Putin said, no, of course he didn't. Why would he? That's NATO business. So, I told him afterwards, roughly what America had asked for at that time.
I was going to say, in this case, Article 5 was invoked and was able to be passed by all of the member states. What did that mean in terms of NATO support for what would become an operation in Afghanistan?
Well, it was a hugely symbolic decision to be taken, and had huge implications in America, big coverage as well. And we sent the NATO AWACS fleet to cover the Salt Lake City Winter Olympics that were going on at the time, which allowed America to send its AWACS, the early warning aircraft, to Afghanistan at that time as well. So it meant that symbolically that we were going to support the Americans and what they needed to do as a consequence of the attack on the Twin Towers and on Washington and the Pentagon as well. And they asked for a whole series of things. They asked for overflight rights. They asked for ports and harbors. They asked for refueling, all of the things that were going to be required in order to take on the Taliban in Afghanistan. But it didn't drag every country into that particular battle, although most of the countries were involved, and certainly one on America's side.
This was nearly now a quarter of a century ago, and looking back, do you feel that the Article 5 response was the best one, the appropriate one? You're aware, of course, of all of the think tankers, myself included in my latter years, who have written articles saying, well, maybe the United States should have made more of it at the time. This gesture of support from the Allies, that we should have all gone off together to Afghanistan, rather than NATO only going 2 years later. There should have, in a sense, there should have been a more sort of robust response. Is that fair, or at the end of the day, looking back on it, do you think, for NATO at least, it was the best possible outcome?
I've reflected a lot, and even at that time, that I think that the Americans should have accepted a lot of the offers that were made, because people were instinctively on their side. Remember the headline in Le Monde, "We are all Americans."
Oh yes, indeed.
So there was a huge degree of sympathy. Even Vladimir Putin was the first one on the phone to President Bush to express sympathy and solidarity. So it was there, and a lot of the allies made offers of troops and equipment in order to help with the campaign against the Taliban at that time. But Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, his deputy, both basically said, look, we're big enough and tough enough, we can do it ourselves. And the allies would have to be actually brought on board. And they had this prejudice against some things by NATO, calling it war by committee. But I think later on, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs made a personal apology to me and said, we should not have turned down the offers. We should have had a collective will, and that might have helped later on with Afghanistan if we'd all been in together. And I think there was a lack of grace, a lack of basically political skill in saying we can do it all on our own and we don't want any other people interfering. They could have accepted the offers, and that would have strengthened the American position.
Yeah, the phrase was that it's the mission that decides the coalition rather than the other way around. Since NATO invoked Article 5 for a counter-terrorism case, rather than the Cold War scenario of a full-scale military invasion of NATO territory, the Article 5 collective defence provision has been sort of extended to other things. Of course, cyber attacks, possibly attacks in space, which is now also a domain of operations. It seems to have become rather elastic. Do you feel, with all of your experience, that this elasticity of Article 5, covering more things is the way to go, because there are now more threats that we have to face, and it could help deterrence of cyber attacks or space attacks? Or do you worry that if it goes too far from its sort of classical military domain, there's a danger that it could become a little bit vague and imprecise and maybe undervalued?
No, I don't think so at all. Deterrence is what defence is about. It's not to do with the fighting capability. It is getting into the minds of the enemy or any opponent that there would be disproportionate costs if they were to attack, and therefore building up a deterrent force and capability and national resilience is going to be crucial to make sure that we remain safe and secure. So I don't think I will, or any succeeding Secretary General will be invoking Article 5 for what it was seen as being the conventional way. Remember that, when we invoked Article 5 for a terrorist act, a lot of people said, hey, wait a minute, that's not what it was for.
Yeah, I remember.
It was for a Soviet, tank attack across the North German plains. That was what it was designed for. And therefore, you've got to be flexible if you're going to be able to deal with the kind of threats that we're going to have in the future. Now, I don't think that any aggressor at the moment, any of our potential adversaries, is going to cross that Article 5 line in the way that we would think, either through terrorism or through military means, because it means Armageddon in a nuclear era. But they're quite capable of using cyber attacks or sabotage, disinformation, and therefore we've got to be flexible about how we treat the defence and the security of our people. If an adversary is going to weaken our democratic institutions by interfering in our elections, or by bringing down our critical national infrastructure, they can do much more damage than we are preventing by saying that if your tanks cross the Article 5 line, we will retaliate. And I think therefore, in a modern age where the grey zone warriors are more potent and more dangerous than the conventional aggressors, then we've got to be flexible.
The further we get away from the start of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the more I feel like for my generation and younger, we kind of merge them together as one thing. But of course, very different conflicts. And in this context, NATO played a very different role. So we talked about NATO invoking Article 5 around attacks that emanated from Afghanistan and eventually taking command of the overall mission there. However, in Iraq, there was a coalition that included a handful of NATO member states, but NATO did not take command of the mission in Iraq or play a significant role. Would you be able to talk about the decision to kind of separate those two, and how challenging was that as different allies from the alliance kind of took a different path around that conflict?
Well, I think the key thing that people need to realize is that NATO is made up of individual countries. It's not some massive bureaucracy. It's not the United Nations, and it's not the European Union. It doesn't have some enormous sort of headquarters, where everybody is blended together. It's an alliance of individual nations, democratic nations. You've got 32, prime ministers, 32 foreign ministers, 32 public opinions, electorates as well. So, it has to be borne in mind that is the kind of organization it is. It's not monolithic. And therefore, Afghanistan came along. There was instinctive sympathy with the United States of America. There was a consensus decision to invoke Article 5. There was a genuine willingness to become involved. And therefore, when it became obvious that the coalitions of the willing, which were running in Afghanistan after the American defeat of the Taliban, that these coalitions, couldn't continue, I had to persuade the countries in the alliance that NATO should take on what is now called the ISAF, the International Security and Assistance Force. So I had to go around, the Russians, the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, the Pakistanis, the Chinese, and even unofficially the Iranians, as well as the NATO countries themselves, to build this consensus that said, right, NATO should take it over at that time. So that is what we did. I fear that coalition, regional coalition that I put together, was eventually abandoned after I left. And I think that's one of the reasons why we didn't ultimately succeed. But in the case of Iraq, there were some serious disagreements among the allies themselves. People who believed that, we shouldn't be doing it. It was the wrong country at the wrong time. That secondly, it was going to dilute, as in fact it did, interest in the mission in Afghanistan. and that they didn't want to become involved. So individual countries did, and NATO, was engaged and involved in helping the countries that were interested in it. But I also had to manage the countries that were very strongly opposed: Germany, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, who were very strongly opposed to what America was doing in Iraq. So, NATO can't do everything all the time. It is what the individual countries choose to do. And that's why it is distinguished from the Warsaw Pact or from other organizations where it's dictated from the center. It's a very much an amalgamation of individual countries making individual decisions, but then coming to a collective decision.
Lord Robertson, I certainly agree with you about the regional framework for Afghanistan, and you certainly point out that even in your day, like with Jens Stoltenberg in his day, the task of a NATO Secretary General is to keep the family together, and that's not always easy with democracies around the table, but you succeeded. In 2003, NATO took over the command of the ISAF mission in Afghanistan and kept the command all the way through to the end. Why do you think it was important for an international organization like NATO to do this as compared with the traditional coalition of the willing?
We had run out of coalitions of the willing. They weren't terribly willing. The United Kingdom had taken the first headquarters there, and I think Turkey was the second country, but after that it was going to be very difficult to do. And in any event, that's what NATO was there for. The SHAPE headquarters, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, is a military headquarters which can do everything, all the things that are required in order to deal with a complicated operation. And therefore it made perfect sense that it took over ISAF at that point. But it wasn't easy to do. The United Kingdom was reluctant because they'd already done it as a coalition. The United States didn't want to do it because they thought that the Europeans should be doing more, and they'd done the battle, the winning of the war. So I had to go and persuade individual countries, including the United States. And I had to go to the Oval Office. I had to persuade President George W. Bush at a meeting in the Oval Office that NATO was the only organization that was capable of running ISAF in the way that all the allies wanted it to happen. And I got a change of direction in that meeting. I persuaded President Bush in the meeting, and he persuaded Donald Rumsfeld and others in the room who had been reluctant to do it. So it was an interesting meeting that day, and that's why NATO took over ISAF right through until virtually the end.
Looking beyond, obviously, Afghanistan, Iraq, 9/11, lots of other things happened on your watch. As I said, you were there at a particularly challenging, demanding, but also fascinating time in NATO's history. You had the Prague Summit of 2002 with the outreach for further enlargements to Central and Eastern Europe. You yourself were a great proponent of NATO's transformation, both the headquarters, the bureaucracy. Your mantra was capabilities, 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 which certainly resonates with NATO today. You spent a lot of your time in the Balkans because you obviously were associated with that personally, but making sure that region moved forward. I was with you in Russia, in Moscow, so I saw you at first hand as you negotiated with Putin. Can you say a little bit, particularly as you look back on your time as Secretary General, what other things you really would like to pick out of things? Well, yep, that's where, I was able to sort of move the cursor a bit, and those were things were important. But I think our audience would like to get a sense, what you really feel was your legacy, your own, the way that you would like to define it from your time as Secretary General.
Well, that's a big question. If I was to say the completion of the Berlin Plus arrangements was one of my great achievements, I don't think it would mean anything to the younger generation or even the older generation. But that was the method by which the European Union could access NATO capabilities, in a situation where America didn't want to be involved. So, but let's leave that aside for the moment. That's a really a geek issue. But I would point to Russia, because I was one of the first foreign visitors to see Vladimir Putin. They were one of his very first foreign visitors, and I went to Moscow in 2001. He'd just become the president. Nobody else had met him at that point. They wanted to restore relations with NATO, which had been broken off because of Kosovo. And this new man had come in, and I flew to Moscow. I was given a plane by the German government in order to get me to Moscow. It was the dead of winter, and snow was on the ground. It was February, I think it was, and I got off the plane at the Moscow airport and did a huge press point in front of the plane, wearing a fur hat in the snow. And in the morning, the television screens, every channel on Russian television had a picture of the Secretary General of NATO arriving in Moscow, standing in front of an aeroplane which had Luftwaffe along the side. Now, given the role of the Luftwaffe in Russia, it was a somewhat controversial title, even although it stands for Air Force. Yes. To do with that. But I had a very good meeting with Vladimir Putin that day. I met him 9 times during my time at NATO. In 2002, we created the NATO-Russia Council. Yeah. We buried the Cold War. We made a lot of statements about the end of that antagonism, building new relationship. NATO created NATO and Russia together created a whole series of working parties that looked at common issues like terrorism and military medicine and search and rescue at sea. We were engaged in all of that, which has all crumbled away as Vladimir Putin has transferred from being the man I stood beside on the 28th of May 2002 and who said these words: "The Ukraine is a sovereign, independent nation state which will make its own decisions about peace and security," into this monster who now says that Ukraine has no right to exist and that he is going to crush it and kill it and take it over.
Ladies and gentlemen, in Rome today, you will have seen for yourself the extraordinary new spirit invigorating the NATO-Russia relationship. The new spirit of NATO-Russia cooperation has turned what was unthinkable into reality. And the 20 countries in this NATO-Russia Council are now committed to translate the spirit on show here today into a genuine equal partnership. And I repeat, a genuine and equal partnership that can indeed change the world for the better.
The Rome Declaration on the new quality in relations between NATO and Russia is a very, very important step in the development between NATO and Russia in a direction of a genuine equal partnership. This is a partnership that will be based on trust and mutual respect for the other's interests. We accept that the views of NATO and Russia on certain security-related issues may not always coincide, but we do know and are convinced that what unites us is far more serious and far outweighs what divides us.
So I was there at the good days when we created something in a good relationship, and I'm now campaigning strongly and purposefully against what Putin is now doing in Ukraine. It's a sad transformation.
But I don't suppose, Lord Robertson, that you buy at all into this revisionist thesis that it's all NATO's fault, of course, because of the process of enlargement or whatever, or that it was NATO that missed a lot of opportunities along the way.
It's nothing to do with NATO enlargement. He never raised that. He never complained about NATO enlargement once to me during 9 meetings that I had with him all that time. He just doesn't like democracy. He can't. What he has done cannot be justified by any standard at all. He's broken the United Nations Charter. He's broken the Budapest Memorandum, the Vienna Accords, the Helsinki Final Act, all of the agreements that were signed by his predecessors, and the one that he signed himself. He signed the Rome Declaration, which actually guaranteed the territorial integrity of all countries in Europe. He's betrayed all of that. So whether it has to do with the European Union getting closer or NATO getting closer, these are all after the event inventions to justify simple, naked, unprovoked aggression against a neighbouring country.
How do you sort of evaluate where NATO is today? Do you think that NATO was in better shape at 75 than it was when you were there at 50?
I think they did an extremely good job. The communique that came out, agreed by all 32 countries, is firm and it's purposeful and it looks forward, and it talks about genuine security for all of the countries. You know, and the remarkable thing is, after 75 years, the alliance is still there. You know, at the beginning they thought it would last 20 years.
That's right.
And here it is at 75, and it allows 1 billion people to sleep easily in their beds overnight. You know, 1 billion people covered in 32 countries, spending $1 trillion on defense, you know, and giving safety and security to people as well. And the two things that I would say that still need to be done, there are two things that I would recommend. One is we need to have an international and a national conversation with the populations of the countries of NATO to persuade them that national security is an insurance policy that has to be paid for. They can't go around pretending that there are no threats, there are no problems, and it's all theoretical. We're seeing in the Donbass, in Ukraine, you know, the reality of the threat that is faced. It's not academic anymore. It's not theoretical. It's not a possibility. It's an actuality. And it's brutal, and it's horrible, and it's terrible, and it could come to us tomorrow. And there needs to be a conversation about the priorities in countries, about spending properly on security and defence. And the second thing that I think needs to happen in NATO, and I'd be interested in what Preston thinks about that, is the American public need to realise that NATO is a huge bargain for the United States of America. The 65,000 troops, American troops, who are based in Europe, are not there just protecting Europe. They are the front line of the defence of the territory of the United States of America. So I think, you know, a much better job has got to be done in telling the American people about what a bargain NATO represents for them.
I think that's a great point, sir. And I think something that we've struggled with in communicating is it's very easy to look at dollar amounts and the size of a military or the number of troops in uniform. That's very tangible. It's harder to quantify the effect on the U.S. military with intelligence sharing with NATO allies, basing rights in certain countries, overflight rights. That is very hard to put a number to and to put on a scoreboard, if you will. And I think in turn, the messaging has not been as robust there as it probably could be. But I agree. I think NATO is a net positive for the United States. And overall, I think it benefits our armed forces. It makes us a stronger entity in the world. So we've spent a lot of time looking back at your time as Secretary General and leading up to NATO and the events around 9/11. We have a new Secretary General coming in to take over the reins at NATO here. What advice would you offer him based off of your experience in that same position?
My advice to former Prime Minister Rutte is to remember that the engine room of NATO is the North Atlantic Council, the ambassadors to NATO. You've got to make sure that they are of the highest quality, that they are connected to the political establishment of their countries so that they can speak with authority and make decisions on behalf of their government. And, you know, the majority of Secretaries General were either defence or foreign ministers. Recently, they've gone for heads of government. And I think heads of governments can sometimes think that they are still heads of government. But the engine room of NATO is the ambassadorial level, who meet every week, at least once a week, sometimes many times a week. That's where the working level goes on. And I would strongly recommend to Mr. Rutte, to engage with them and make sure, therefore, that the organisation is as good and as effective as it has been in the past and needs to be in the future.
Lord Robertson, on behalf of Preston and I, again, a massive thanks. I knew that you were going to be frank with lots and lots of insights, and you would have good, clear messages. And you never disappoint, and you haven't on this occasion either. But again, thanks for being our special guest today and helping us to trace these important years in NATO history, which indelibly bear your stamp. Thanks again.
Been a great pleasure. Thank you, and to you and to Preston for exacting questions. I've loved it.
Thank you. So, Preston, I think as we both sort of guessed, Lord Robertson has lost none of his mental sharpness. He recalls all of the history very, very well, and he was very good at taking us through it and analysing it with some interesting anecdotes along the way. So what did you make of it?
A couple big takeaways for me, Jamie, was first when he mentioned that it wasn't the United States seeking Article 5 to be invoked following 9/11. I didn't know that. I didn't know the ins and outs of all this, but that he went to his colleagues saying, hey, it was an attack. Is this something we should do? And then also his talking about how he doesn't expect that Article 5 to be invoked by any other Secretary General, that adversarial nations might not want to cross that line. So it's both of those are things I hadn't really heard before, opinions I hadn't heard before, and interesting to think about.
Yeah, no, me too. I thought he gave some great insights. I mean, the first thing is the importance of diplomacy. He spoke all the time about building coalitions, building very quickly within 24 hours a coalition in the alliance to support the invocation of Article 5, convincing the United States to go down that path. He spoke about trying to get Putin on board at the time successfully. He then obviously spoke about trying to put a regional framework together to deal with Afghanistan. So you get the impression of somebody who knows that before he can sort of push a button and have any kind of action, he's got to build this sort of supporting coalition of key players who are going to back him. I thought that was very interesting indeed. I think at the end he made some excellent arguments about NATO's relevance to the US and why it's just as much in the US interest to be part of NATO as for the Europeans. Let's just hope that those messages, Preston, you've got to play a role here. You're closer to the action than I am. You're in Washington at the summit. You've got to help to get those messages across. Preston, again, great to partner with you. I always say, and I mean it, let's hope we could do it again. But thanks again for giving us your time today.
Thanks so much for having me, Jamie. We'll see y'all next time.
Dear listeners, dear viewers, once again, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I hope that if it was the first time that you are following the podcast, you will be sufficiently motivated to go and have a look at the previous podcast, NATO Through Time, that we have produced. If you are a serial reoffender in coming back to the podcast, then please stay tuned for further episodes in the future. But from NATO headquarters in Brussels, it's goodbye for now.